All right, juniors, we are going to look at our first work of this new unit and of this new semester, which is going to be the Ambrose Bierce story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Not my favorite story. It's good. It's really well written, actually. But you know, there's stuff about this time period in the writing that kind of throws me sometimes. So we'll talk about that more when we get into the story. Let's start by talking about our unit title for this time, and that is, When Did the American Dream Die? So, at least the initial incarnation. So, the American Dream is something that, is frequently discussed, and we built the entire year, all of our units around it. The first semester, we really kind of discussed the formation of that dream, what it meant, how it initially started. Now, we're going to talk about the spot where, personally, I think that initial incarnation of the dream, the idea that you can come to America with nothing and come from nowhere and, through your own effort, hard work, you could make yourself something, that you could become, important through your own effort. And because we had so much, opportunity here, and I believe that this time period, and we're studying like 1850 to the early 1900s, really 1900. I feel like this period had an event in it, particularly, that marks the end of that. And we start to see that changing. We see it in the writing. Remember, writing is reflecting society, typically, at least literature is. It often reflects the problems and the occurrences that are going on in society. So the change in the tenor of the writing magnifies how, the situations that were happening. So one of the questions I ask you in your reading guides is that, what is the event that marked the end of the end of the typical American dream, the original American dream? And really, guys, there's one big event that it's hard to ignore that occurs in this 50-year time period. Now, not the entire time. It's actually in the early part of it. So from 1850 to 1900, any of you that have paid a bit of attention in history should know what occurred during this time, which I think really marked the end of the innocence for this country, as it was, and that's the Civil War. Okay, now let's understand that before this period, there was a lot of bad things going on in our country, and a lot of people knew about it and allowed it to go on. Slavery is something that should have never occurred in our country, and it had been not only allowed but applauded in many quarters. But the Civil War really showed a side of our country that was not a good look. The violence that came with it. Remember, this time period, violence wasn't as, yes, people lived much more violent lives, but they weren't as numb to it as we are today, because we're surrounded by it. Man, we see it on TV daily. We play it in video games. I love video games. Y'all know that. I'm not talking bad about them. I'm just saying there's a lot of violence in that, and with as realistic as games have become, we're surrounded by these images. But in this time period, that wasn't the case. So, dealing with, what looked like this country that, had overcome these odds and was, representative of the American dream itself, was, threatened by this event, and it was a really scary time period. I think afterwards, the way it changed our country, it definitely impacted the way people wrote. And we're going to get into that more in our next story, the Stephen Crane story, when we start talking about naturalism, which I really feel like, personally, is an offshoot of what we see out of the Civil War. It impacted the way people felt. The same way we're going to see a lot of writers over in Europe impacted after World War I, how that altered the writing of many of their great writers, and some of them here as well, Ernest Hemingway, for example. But we're going to begin by tackling something called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is actually set during the Civil War. So we're going to see a little bit about, the main character in this, a guy named Peyton Farquhar, how, what his concept of the American dream was, and how this story shows, in a way, like the death of that. Okay, now it's a push. I'm stretching it a little bit, but I promise you it's there. So let's start by talking about our big literary element of this, which is point of view. We're going to talk about point of view in this story because the author does something odd and he plays with the point of view. It changes. It's not the same. A lot of times you may have a static point of view throughout a story. This one doesn't. It changes. In fact, he does something really weird at the end where he even changes verb tenses, something you would lose points for in an essay. But remember, now this is professional. The rules in writing are there for beginners. Once you become good at it, you can break them as long as it's purposeful and it, is done well. So, and Bierce does both of those with this story. Okay. Now, let me point out An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and a lot of the stories from this unit, this particular miniature unit, I'm not reading them to you. Okay, you can read this. This is not in this. You don't need me to walk you through it like maybe some of the poems. So I'm going to discuss it here, but you are still responsible for going back and reading this material. So please make sure that is done. Okay. All right, so point of view. We've got two primary ones that we talk about, especially in high school. You get your first person where the narrator is actually part of the story. You see a lot of I, me, we type of pronoun usage outside of dialogue. Third person, on the other hand, the narrator is not a part of the story, and you'll see a lot of he, she, they outside of dialogue. You'll see I and me and stuff in dialogue, but that's the characters themselves talking. So remember, that's not always a giveaway about what type of point of view you're using. Now, there's other types of point of view, and within these two categories, there's subcategories, okay? So there's a lot more discussion to this, but we're going to save that for a later date. What we want to do is we want to take the third person particularly and break it into two specific types, again, which we could break down farther in a more advanced class. We've got third person omniscient, which is where the narrator can kind of see inside the heads of everyone. He knows everything that's going on. It's not a great point of view to write from. It robs you of suspense, at least believable suspense, and it becomes a really thick book because you're telling everything. It's not a great usage of it, but third person limited is our other one, and that's more common in my opinion. Third person limited is going to be, again, the narrator that's removed from the action, but they really only are able to, tell from the perspective of one or two, maybe a couple more characters, but definitely not all of them, okay? So we're going to see a switch between these. We're going to see a little bit of third-person omniscient as we start. It's going to blend into some third-person limited. You can argue that there's some first-person. I would say that that's completely wrong, but I've heard kids try to make that play. All right? So let's look. Your book, we're on page 481. A really good image there on 480 with the splash page that has the title and everything. Really awesome. So what we wanted to begin with is we want to tackle the first three paragraphs. And they're very imagery heavy. In fact, most of this story is. A lot of you are going to struggle with that. You're not going to like all the imagery. You're going to be like, okay, it's a bridge. Let's move on. We're that way because we are people who are highly visual and we're used to seeing these things. If you're not sure what, we spend so many time looking at images on the internet. We don't really need all the description, but it still shows you what kind of art this author, Ambrose Bierce, had, that he was able to do this, especially later in the story when you get to the part about Peyton Farquhar, the feeling of being hanged. The description there is unreal how much it makes my throat even close up reading it, knowing what this was like, okay? So, but these first three paragraphs here that go from 481 over to page 482, we have sentences like, let's read the very beginning. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrist bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners, 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. Now there's a lot more, but I just wanted to use that as an example. We're getting the description of a man who's about to be executed. He's about to be hanged on this bridge, the Owl Creek Bridge, you can assume. And the writing here is very detached. It's telling it very just matter-of-factly. Here's the description. This is telltale of omniscient, third-person omniscient writing. Very removed from it. It's more like here's a photograph. Let me describe it to you. All right. It's really well done. It's beautifully done. It's a very tragic scene, but it's amazingly well done. As we read through this, we find out a little bit more about this character. We don't have his name yet, but we do find out that he's a civilian, which for us, removed from this time period, this is disturbing. A military execution of a civilian seems to be like, what could he have possibly done? Your book points out that this was a little more common, especially for during this time period. The Civil War, you would have people, who, if there's a battle taking place in the South, Southerners would frequently try to sabotage the Northern, their encampments. So obviously you had to, try to send a message. So I get why this was a thing, but man, it just doesn't sit well with a lot of us, the fact that they're executing a civilian in this particular manner. And, Ambrose Bierce does a great job of making us really initially feel some sympathy for this guy, because he does, like, this is a guarantee when you're talking about this. He mentions this man about to be executed as he's thinking about his wife and children. So we get this image of this guy being a good dad, and good husband, despite we have no clue what he did. Obviously something bad, but, he's very, in his last moments, he wants to picture this family life he had, which he can't be that bad is what we think. But man, one of the great things about this is immediately, as soon as you start feeling that way, we get into section 2 on page 483, and Bierce drops us a detail about Mr. Farquhar that makes us maybe rethink, or you should rethink your sympathy for him. Listen to this first part. It says, Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. Being a slave owner, and like any other slave owners, a politician, he was naturally an original secessionist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Now, okay, now I kind of, like, personally, I felt bad for him, wife and kids, a family guy, and then it said he's a slave owner, and I'm like, ugh, I got nothing for this guy now. I realize that some of you may not have that same revulsion I do, and that disturbs me, but I definitely don't care about this character's life or death at this point. Slave owner is garbage in my head, so this is not a big deal as much as it was. And I would say that when Bierce wrote this, that would not be the most common response. A lot of people, probably were still more sympathetic to people like that, and they probably didn't have the same distaste that we do today. So I feel like that's something that's probably changed over time, but it still works because it shows you how easy it is to shift feelings about a character. Now, we're not talking about characterization particularly, but remember, just because we're talking about point of view mainly, and we didn't mention characterization, doesn't mean it's not still important, okay? All right, so for me personally, my initial bit of sympathy is now turned to one more of disgust. Okay. We also, in this section, we get a little bit of exposition. This is becoming, this is really common in modern writing, and it really became common, I see, in the 1800s, where writers would not begin with exposition. They might start you with what we got here, this image of this man about to be executed, leaving you with questions about why, and then later fill that in. Breaking the chronology of a story, it may seem like that's not a great way to tell a story, but it actually really is. It locks readers in early to where they're attentive to it, and then later it's going to explain the why, the more boring elements of the narrative. So we learn at this point that Mr. Farquhar wanted to be a soldier, but for some reason, and we never learn why, wasn't able to. So, he feels almost like it's a slight to his manhood that he can't go off and fight for his beliefs. So he's just itching for reasons to find some way to involve himself so he can feel like he's a part of the cause. We see that today with people all the time, people who go to protests and stuff. That allows you to insert yourself and be part of a cause, even if maybe you can't directly impact it. We feel like that's, it. Now, this guy is trying to actually directly impact it. Even though he can't be a soldier, he does get an idea of something because of a random soldier that comes by his place one day. It says he's dressed in gray, which indicates he's a Confederate soldier. Sadly, in my class, people didn't know that. But yes, the colors were gray for the South, blue for the North. So he comes in and he indicates something that's been going on about this bridge. Again, the Owl Creek Bridge, I'm assuming, and how it's being guarded because they're worried about sabotage. And he points out that any civilians that sabotage it would immediately be subject to hanging. Now, put two and two together, we can say, okay, so this man must have tried to do something to the bridge, and that would explain why he's being hanged. Again, good writing doesn't always spell things out for you. Sometimes you have to actually put some of the effort into it. I know in your writing I tell you not to do that, but there's a difference in writing a story, a narrative, and writing an essay. So those are not the same things exactly. So we find out that this soldier mentions this to Farquhar, and they tell him basically that there's very few guards and that you could easily burn this bridge down given the right setting. And so Farquhar assumes that's what he's going to do. Of course, then you get a little bit of a twist because as the soldier leaves, he doubles back and heads north, not south, and they point out he's a federal scout, or he's a spy. He's actually from the north, not the south. So we know ahead of time that, and again, this is because of the break in chronology. It helps. The story's not always about suspense. Sometimes it's more about the message, and we're getting that here. So we know now, okay, this guy's in trouble. I guess it's not really dramatic irony, but it's kind of dramatic irony that we as the readers know he's obviously not going to pull this off because we know he's being hanged from the bridge at the beginning of the story. And so he obviously doesn't know that's going to happen. All right, then we get into section 3, which is really an interesting section. We go back to the imagery. Section 1 and 3 are your imagery sections. 2 is your exposition. So 3, we go back into some really interesting imagery. Now, at the beginning, not so much. But at the end, it definitely switches to what I termed as fantastical imagery. You start seeing grotesque shapes and weird colors and trees that are shaped wrong and colors where they don't belong. That's going to be the fantastical part. Before that, it's, again, very detailed and great description, but there's also a lot of, it slows down. I don't know if you caught that or not. We get very long paragraphs, very strong detail here, as you know the beginning of section 3, which is, I believe it's paragraph 12 in your book. I mean, the description of being hanged is enough that I can almost feel it around my neck. Then we get this image that it snaps. The rope snaps. He falls into the water, and you get this whole thing of him fighting to stay alive because he's worried now he's going to drown. He eventually, the soldiers start firing on him. Even the cannon is shot at him. And during this time, there's a lot of details that you should be a little bit of a red flag for you. I mean, first of all, firing a cannon to get one guy seems to be a little bit much, but you also see his senses are heightened. He's stronger than he normally is. He can hear better. He sees things he could never see before. All of that kind of starts indicating to me that something's weird. Remember, every time you're reading a story, you want to be drawn to details that seem out of place because authors purposely craft those. So all of this is meant to get our attention. Okay, so eventually, as this section goes on, he's able to get out of the water and he heads back to his home. Now, remember, you saw this earlier in the story if you read it. The Owl Creek Bridge was a good distance from his home, so it takes him all day. He gets back to his home, and as he gets there, things just don't look right. They look weird. He sees his wife come down to greet him. He's really excited to see her. Goes into a lot of really beautiful, almost romantic detail there, and then you get the twist ending. If you look on page 489, the very end, last paragraph, it's all of one sentence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body with a broken neck swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. What we learn at the end is this man never escaped. The rope didn't snap. He actually was hanged. And all of the stuff that happened in section 2 and 3, really, especially 3, is him, his mind coming to deal with that, coping with that as he's, dying. And I explained to kids in class, this is really, similar to a lot of us, how time seems to slow down in very dramatic moments, like a car crash or something. I don't know if you've ever been in a wreck before, but you can see it happening and it feels like everything comes to a crawl. And then, the event, and of course it didn't, but for whatever reason, our brain processes it that way. And that's what's happened here. So when we go back to the American Dream here, what's this dealing with? Well, the concept here, Farquhar wanted to be, was still holding on to this old version of the American Dream. He wanted to be someone, he wanted to be a part of something, and he was going to do his best to get in. He got involved in it, and it bit him in the tail. He ended up dead, losing his family for it. But this shows, again, this idea of, executing your own citizen, man. That's tough. And we see how stuff like that scars a country. It's not easy to come back from that. We haven't. We're 100 and something years later, and we're still dealing with the scars from the Civil War, which, there was stuff before that added to it. But, we haven't recovered from this as a country. There's still a lot of, tenseness among this. And it shows us the American Dream has to take a new angle. And, as we get in through this year, get closer to April and May, we're going to start talking about the new direction this dream has to go in so that we can somehow come full circle and realize these dreams we had back in the 1700s. Because, guys, we're pretty far away from them these days. Our country's not the, shining city on a hill that a lot of us figure it is, and a lot of us saw it as way back when. It's changed greatly, all right? Okay, so that gets us through this. Now, again, I want you to read the story. Just listening to me give you the basics of it, even if you did it before you read it, may be helpful, but it is not what you're to do. You need to read the whole thing, too. Those of you who were with me in class and read it, you're good. You may want this as a review. But those of you from home, make sure you read, okay? All right, guys. Well, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to go and do something for my seniors. We're tackling Macbeth, so y'all will have that next year. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned a little bit. I hope that it gave you something to think about, and I hope you're looking forward to reading our next story, which is going to be by Stephen Crane. I just dropped the story name, actually. What was it? It was An Episode of War, and we're going to talk a lot about naturalism, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm thrilled about these next few videos. I hope you guys are enjoying this, and I will talk to you again soon as we move into one of my favorite periods of writing. Okay, have a great evening, guys.